Thanks very much, everybody. How you doing? It's great to be here today. It's always a privilege to be invited to an event like this to share a few thoughts on the upcoming hurricane season. I'm often humbled by the fact that people want me to come and talk and yap away about tropical storms and hurricanes, and we're going to do just that. So again, thank you for the invitation. I want to begin by thanking you for coming. I know you got lots of choices. It's a Saturday, the sun is shining. You could be doing something else, and the fact that you're here speaks volumes about the fact that you want to be prepared for the upcoming hurricane season. And you know, hurricanes are big, bad, scary things. But here's the thing. A hurricane is the one storm that no one should ever die from. I mean, think about it. We know when storms are most likely. They're most likely to impact this area in August and September and early October. So we have plenty of notice. You know, several months from now, we know we may see a storm. And if something develops in the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea, we can see it. You can watch us on television. You can go to your favorite website. You can see it. The forecasts from the Hurricane Center have gotten more and more accurate. You know, that cone of uncertainty that we show on TV, you know what we call that in the newsroom? We call that the cone of death. It's just a newsroom humor. But that cone of uncertainty continues to get narrower and narrower each year because the forecasts from the Hurricane Center are getting better and better every year. They're getting much, much better. So we know when a storm is likely, we know when a storm forms, and we know when a storm is headed our way. And if we use our wits, and if we're prepared, and we don't panic, no one should ever die. It's the one storm that no one should ever die from. Now, we're going to have issues. We're going to have a mess to clean up, but you should not be hurt, and you should not be damaged. So yeah, hurricanes are big, they're bad, they're scary, but there's something we can all survive from. Here's the other thing about hurricanes. Thankfully, they don't happen very often. You know, when we look at all the weather phenomenon that we deal with every day here in Port St. Lucie and along the Treasure Coast, thunderstorms. I mean, we're in the wet season now. We're going to see rain and thunderstorms just about every day. And in those thunderstorms, we have lightning bolts. You know, it's not uncommon to have a thunderstorm right here producing hundreds of lightning bolts over a short period of time. And when we add up all the lightning bolts, and we can count them, I love to show that on TV, by the way. You know, we'll put a little box around a storm that's moving through Port St. Lucie, and we'll say in the past 15 minutes, this thunderstorm produced 250 lightning bolts. We love to show that. So we can count the lightning bolts. And on average, across the United States, there are millions and millions of lightning strikes, on average about 22 million lightning strikes. That's a ton of electricity. Then you look at tornadoes. Strange stats so far this year. There have been more tornadoes in Florida than in Oklahoma. And you think of Oklahoma as Tornado Alley, where all those big, bad tornadoes develop. But this year, because of a variety of reasons, we've actually had more tornadoes in Florida. That came up last night because we had a weak tornado just south of Tampa in Riverview, and it caused a little bit of damage over there. But on average, in the United States, we get about 1,000 tornadoes. We get more tornadoes in the United States than any other part of the country, any other part of the world. So, millions of lightning bolts, about 1,000 tornadoes, hurricanes. On average, for the 6-month-long hurricane season, covering thousands of square miles, we get 6 hurricanes. That's the average. I mean, that's not much. I mean, some years, obviously, you get more, some you get less, but it takes a special series of circumstances all coming together to create a hurricane. And the big ones, the really big ones, category 3, 4, or 5, are even more rare. Now, in meteorology, we call a hurricane the greatest storm on Earth. You know, when those storms do form, they're pretty awesome. In terms of power, it's incredible. You know, what was it, the circus? They used to say the greatest show on Earth, right? Well, if you look at a Category 5 hurricane moving over the open waters of the Atlantic with a large eye, in my opinion, that's the greatest show on Earth. And thankfully, it's also the most rare event in the world as well. But these storms are incredibly powerful. Take, for example, a Category 1 hurricane, winds of 75 miles per hour. And let's say it's offshore of the Treasure Coast, and we can go out there and start pulling energy out of it for a 24-hour period, just 24 hours, and then find a way to store that energy. We would have enough energy in one day from a hurricane to power all the homes in North America for about 6 months. It's just incredible how much energy and how much power is there. That's why it's called the greatest storm on Earth. So today, what we're going to talk about with my little slide presentation, a little hurricane history, some greatest hits, if you will, of hurricanes, including Andrew, Floyd, Francis, Jean, Wilma. We all remember those storms, right? What a mess it was. And frankly, it's hard to believe it's been 10 years since Hurricanes Francis and Jean came our way. I mean, it seems like yesterday. And then Wilma in October of 2005. We'll talk a little bit about where hurricanes form, month by month, how hurricanes form, and then some of the problems that a hurricane produces when it makes landfall. All right? So let's begin with a little hurricane history. And we'll start with numero uno, and that's got to be Hurricane Andrew. Incredible storm. Anybody go through Hurricane Andrew? There we go. Category 5 monster. Winds of 160 miles per hour when it slammed into Miami-Dade County at 5 a.m. on August 24th, 1992. And if you remember it, if you were here at the time, at one point, the forecast from the National Hurricane Center had that storm moving toward the Treasure Coast, actually the Fort Pierce, Vero Beach area. But then the forecast was shifted south, and farther south until it actually made landfall in Miami-Dade County. 1992 was a, quote, quiet year in the tropics. Just like this is supposed to be a quiet year in the tropics. There were just 4 hurricanes that entire year. Just 4. Andrew was the first one. So technically and statistically a quiet hurricane season, but don't tell anyone in Florida that Hurricane Andrew, that it was a quiet hurricane season. And you know, when we get hit by a storm, as we did with Francis and Jean and Wilma, and as we did with Hurricane Andrew, sometimes it's a good thing because we learn so much about hurricane preparation. We learn so much about ourselves, and that was the case with Andrew. Andrew changed just about everything when it came to hurricane preparation. Because of Andrew, we now have stronger building codes. Because of Andrew, if you buy a house here in St. Lucie County, a brand new house, you have to have some kind of window protection. You know, before Andrew, that wasn't the case. Andrew changed the way that emergency managers plan. It just changed the whole dynamic. And because of that, when we got hit by Francis and Jean and Wilma, we were better prepared. But Francis and Jean and Wilma taught us a lot too. We learned a lot. We learned what to do after a hurricane hit. You know, the most telling statistic after Francis and Jean hit in South Florida, that terrible season in 2004, we had Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean, 4 hurricanes in 6 weeks. The most telling statistic after that storm was what happened when the storms were all gone. We lost 92 people when the sky was blue and the storms were gone. Because most of us had never gone through a hurricane, we were doing silly things. We weren't stopping at 4-way stops. We brought generators in homes. We were trying to fix our roof and fell off. So through a multiple of accidents and mostly not knowing what to do, a lot of us, unfortunately, got hurt. But again, another educational experience. So the next time a hurricane hits, and you know it's inevitable that where we're standing right now, a hurricane will hit someday, the next time we get hit, we'll be much better off and much better prepared. So that's Andrew back in 1992. As you can see, 7 years later, we got a big scare from a hurricane called Floyd. Now, Floyd was almost as strong as Andrew. Andrew was a tiny little storm. I mean, the hurricane force winds were in a 20-mile diameter. And it was almost as if a tornado tore through Miami-Dade County. Floyd, on the other hand, was huge, maybe 2.5 times bigger, and almost as strong. And it was coming right at us. And it seemed as if there was no way that this storm was going to miss us. But somehow, at the last second, it kind of took a little turn to the right, a little pivot to the right, and missed South Florida. I mean, I can still remember being on the air, and at the time, our hurricane expert was Dr. Bob Sheets, the former director of the Hurricane Center, and I can remember talking with him live on the air, and I said, saying to him, you know, Bob, it sure looks like it's starting to make a turn to the right. And he said, yeah, I see that too. And he said, but we have to be cautious. We have to keep watching to make sure that this does indeed take place. And it did. And we were saved. Because if that storm had hit, again, 2.5 times larger than Andrew and about the same intensity, goodness, the damage would have been incredible. Andrew caused more than $25 billion in damage and hit south of Miami, in Miami-Dade County. This storm was moving through, or headed toward the heart of Palm Beach County and parts of the Treasure Coast. It would have been a huge mess. So we were lucky, incredibly lucky. In fact, for a long time, in the 90s and through the first part of the 21st century, we were so lucky storms would come at us and then make a big turn to the right. But all that luck changed in 2004. Who would have thunk it, right? We're going to have 2 hurricanes. See if you believe this. If I told you this was going to happen, you're going to have 2 hurricanes this year. They're going to hit in exactly the same spot, exactly 3 weeks apart. They'd say, Mike, get that guy a straitjacket. He's crazy. There's no way that that's going to happen. But that's exactly what happened. Francis hit on a Saturday night, moving onshore. Again, for most of us, it was the first time we ever dealt with a hurricane. We go through the entire process of cleaning up. We get power back on. Everything's good. And I come on TV and say, guess what? We got another one coming. I'm sure you threw something at the TV that night. It was one of those strange events. And Gene, in particular, was such an odd hurricane. Gene came off the coast of Africa, like many storms do, in late August and early September. And I'll show you that graphic in just a second. But she's coming off the coast of Africa. She goes through the Caribbean. She becomes a tropical storm. And she gets down in the southern Caribbean and kind of falls apart. I mean, she's a tropical depression. The winds are 35 miles per hour. And I'm thinking, let's watch it, but boy, it looks like this one might be done. It sits down there for about a day, just kind of wandering around. No steering currents at all. It's just very odd, and it's very weak. Then it just kind of drifts a little bit to the north, gets over some warm water, starts to fire up again, and then that big dome of high pressure that was over Bermuda grabbed it. The storm intensified rapidly, and the high pressure just flung it right at Florida, and it hit. It was just the strangest thing. I mean, this storm actually, as it went through parts of the Caribbean, did a complete 360-degree loop. Strange. I mean, odd, incredible, but obviously devastating for us. So we got through that incredible 2004 hurricane season, and then came 2005. Remember 2005? 2005 was the year we had so many storms, we ran out of names. We went through the entire list. That hurricane season was nuts. It was like fast-forward hurricane season. We started in June with storms. We had storms in July. We had storms in August. We had storms in September. We had storms in October, November, December. It was as if the hurricane season was never going to end. We had to use a supplemental list. You guys remember this? We used the Greek alphabet. I don't ever want to use the Greek alphabet again. That's some crazy stuff. And if you told me that we would be hit by a hurricane that started with the letter W, it's like, come on, crazy. And here's the other crazy thing about Wilma. Look where she was. Wilma was west and south of us. Now, most of the time, if a storm is west and south of us, you're thinking, okay, probably won't impact us. It'll probably go into the Gulf of Mexico, it'll go into the Yucatan Peninsula, probably fall apart, something like that. But remember, it was late October. In fact, this was 8 days before Halloween. Talk about your trick or treat, right? And the upper level winds, the jet stream, was moving across the northern Gulf Coast. So Wilma, again, timing is everything in life, was in a perfect spot to be grabbed by the jet stream and to be pulled right across Florida. If it was August or September, Wilma would not have impacted us. But because it was October, it was late in the year, the jet stream was there, cold fronts were coming, perfect timing. Storm went through, although I suppose if there was anything good about Wilma, it was the fact it hit during the day. You know, it seems coincidental, but a lot of the hurricanes want to make landfall at night, which makes them even more scarier for some of us. But Wilma hit during the day, so at least we could see the trees being knocked out. I don't know if that's better or not, but that was Wilma back in 2005. Let's talk about last year. I don't know about you, but I loved last year's hurricane season. It was my favorite hurricane season because there was nothing going on. It was great. It was fabulous. Can we have that every year, right? Nothing. No storms to worry about, except the first one, Andrea, which was a weak tropical storm, which made landfall on Florida's west coast, had problems for us. We had tornadoes down in Palm Beach County in early June of last year. Other than that, it was a great hurricane season. And as you can see, the least active in 45 years. And if you remember, the hurricane forecast last year said, Armageddon, we're going to have a crazy hurricane season. That's what all the experts were saying. So they were dead wrong. So when we go through the forecast today, remember that, because everyone this year is saying, oh, it's going to be a quiet season. Don't worry about it. We'll see about that, right? So 2013, first season, 50 years without a major storm, 4 seasons in history without a major storm. I mean, that's how rare it is. When you look at all the hurricane seasons, we don't have a major storm. Major storm, by the way, is Category 3, 4, or 5. So not to have a big storm is rare. No hurricanes made landfall in the U.S., and it's now 9 years since a hurricane hit here, and of course, that was Wilma. So let's talk about this year. Dr. William Gray of Colorado State University. He's the guy that created the seasonal hurricane forecast 30 years ago. Dr. Gray, brilliant man, probably knows more about hurricanes than anyone who's ever lived. And 30 years ago, he said, you know, I think I can predict how many storms we're going to have during a hurricane season. And Dr. Gray said, I can do it with a simple idea: to predict the future, study the past. So what he did is he looked at every hurricane season going back to the late 19th century. He found busy hurricane seasons, put those in one pile. Quiet hurricane seasons, put them in another pile. Then he went to each pile, each hurricane season, and tried to figure out, well, why was this year so busy? What were the factors that led to a busy season? And why was this season so quiet? What were the factors that led to a quiet season? And from that, he came up with a formula. And in 1984, he announced it to the world and issued a hurricane forecast. Now, when you go to hurricane conferences, Dr. Gray, he's kind of like a rock star. You know, he walks in, he's like a big deal. In Fort Collins, Colorado, at Colorado State, no one knows who this guy is. But he goes to a hurricane conference, it's like, you know, here comes Mick Jagger or something. It's just amazing. And then the other interesting thing about Dr. Gray, and I've kidded him about this in the past, is he's such a nice man, such a wonderful man. He has a slight speech impediment. And it's difficult for him to say the word hurricane. So I think it's a little ironic that maybe the guy who knows more about hurricanes can't say the word hurricane. He kind of goes, hurricane. Just my weird observation. Anyway, Dr. Gray and his group says, hey, quiet year, just 3 hurricanes. Okay, that sounds good. How about AccuWeather, big company in the Northeast? They've been predicting weather. You may, if you're from the Northeast, you may have heard of AccuWeather. They're a private meteorological firm, excellent company. They've been in the hurricane business as well. They kind of agree. They think 10, 5, 2. And again, normal would be 12 storms, 6 hurricanes, and 2 major storms. So they're predicting, you know, slightly below average. One more company. This is a company called Tropical Risk, again, a private consulting firm. They think it's going to be a quiet hurricane season as well. So great news, right? You can just put away your shutters, nothing to worry about. It's going to be a great year. Enjoy your summer. Not so fast, my friend, right? Not so fast, because Florida, and I'll get into why we think it's going to be a quiet season. Part of the reason we have so many hurricanes in Florida is geography. You look at a map, Florida sticks out. You know, we stick out like a sore thumb. And the east coast of Florida in particular really sticks out. You look at the Treasure Coast all the way down to Palm Beach County. So one of the simple reasons why we've been hit by more hurricanes than any other state is simple geography. As these storms are making a turn to the north, we get in the way. So even in quiet years, just like 1992, we can still be struck by a hurricane. So why do we think this year will be a little more quiet? Has to do with water temperature. I know this might be difficult to read, but you can see Africa here, the United States over here, and you see this light blue color. That's sea surface temperatures, water temperatures, and they've been running below average for quite some time. A hurricane, remember, gets its energy from the water. It sits on the water and gets that energy. So if the ocean water temperature is very warm, there's more fuel for that storm's fire. If, on the other hand, that water temperature is a little cool, well, it won't be as strong. So because we expect water temperatures to be below average, storms, especially those big ones coming off Africa, just may not be as popular or as powerful. And here's the other factor, and this is a big one, the return of El Nino. This map here at the top, you can see Central America on the right-hand side. That's South America there. That's the Pacific Ocean. And what we've been watching during the winter months and the spring months is that water temperature in the equatorial Pacific is getting warmer and warmer. And every 3 to 5 years, for reasons we still can't quite figure out, we get this thing called El Nino. The water temperature gets above average, maybe half a degree to 1 degree above average, and it covers thousands of square miles. And what happens is it changes wind patterns. So when you have an El Nino in the equatorial Pacific, and I know at first blush it seems crazy, you're saying, wait a minute, Mike, the water temperature in the Pacific has an impact on hurricanes in the Atlantic? And the answer is yes, in a big way. Because if that water temperature is above average, and it's called El Nino, it shifts the wind, so we get strong wind shear moving across the hurricane breeding ground in the Atlantic. So you could have a hurricane kind of sitting on that water, kind of bubbling away and building vertically into the atmosphere. But if the wind shear comes along, it disrupts that structure and the storm starts to fall apart. So we love El Nino. The last time we had an El Nino, we had zip in the Atlantic. The storms were just being ripped apart. So those big storms that come off the coast of Africa, the big storms coming off the coast of Africa, the ones we fear the most, Andrew, Francis, Jean, they all came off the coast of Africa, so did Wilma. they will be weakened or ripped apart completely as they do so, so that should not be a threat. However, the El Nino really has no impact on storms in the Gulf of Mexico. So, yes, we may see fewer storms in the Atlantic, but what I call homegrown hurricane storms that form in the Gulf, and remember, Wilma, the last hurricane to hit us, came from the Gulf. Those storms can still form as well. So those are some of the factors. All right, hurricane season, as you know, starts tomorrow. It runs for 6 very long months. And each month of the season, we can break down and show you where storms are most likely to form. Now, in June and July, usually we get maybe one storm if it's an average year. And if a storm is going to form, you can see it's going to do so close to us. For a hurricane to form, you need warm water. So those waters in the Gulf and near Florida are pretty warm. And you also need very little wind shear. And sometimes in June and July, you'll get just the perfect environment for storms to form. We get into August and September, it's a whole different story. Water temperatures across the Caribbean, the Atlantic, are plenty warm. Wind shear starting to die down. We start to watch those waves come off Africa. And again, as you can see, storms can form just about anywhere in the tropical Atlantic. October, November. October is still very busy. Obviously, Wilma hit in October. And by November, most of the storms are weaker. We're getting cold fronts coming down, pushing activity much farther to the east. So that's typically where the storms form. How a hurricane forms. Again, as I said, it takes a special series of circumstances. It's difficult, but it happens. And it starts with a little tropical disturbance. I think you can see this right here, 92L, cluster of thunderstorms in the Caribbean. You know, it's tropical moisture, things pop up, so we watch a lot during the season. Little disturbance sits over warm water. The Coriolis effect of the ocean helps get it to spin counterclockwise. Upper level wind shear is light, and that storm starts to build vertically into the atmosphere, and we call it a tropical depression. Winds are about 35 miles per hour. Then we get into a tropical storm. If the winds get up to 39, it becomes a tropical storm, and we give it a name. The first name on the list this year is Arthur. Anybody named Arthur here? No Arts? We had Michael on the list last year, and I'm happy to say I was the strongest storm of 2013. Didn't bother anybody. By the way, the origin of naming hurricanes goes back to the Australians back in the 1930s and 40s. They have a hurricane season just like us. Theirs is in the wintertime, our wintertime. But the Australian Weather Bureau, they had 2 storms at the same time. And they were talking amongst themselves, and they said, what are we going to do? Call it Storm A and Storm B, or Storm 1 or Storm 2? Actually, they call them cyclones down there anyway. And one guy said, I know, let's name them after our ex-girlfriends. So they did. And that practice just kind of started. And you may remember that up until 1979, all the hurricanes that we track were named after ladies. And in 1979, they started using male names, which doesn't make any sense to me. Wait for it, because I've never heard of a hurricane. Have you? Thank you, thank you. I'm here all day. Thank you, thank you. Make sure you tip your waitresses. All right, here we go. Let's talk about the impact from a hurricane. And there are 4 primary impacts. And while we talk a lot in the media about the winds associated with a hurricane, it's really water that we fear the most. Freshwater flooding and storm surge. Storm surge is the ocean moving onshore. It's almost like a wall of water moving onshore as a hurricane makes landfall. For us, because of the closeness of the continental shelf, our storm surge would not be that significant until you move up into Indian River County. What is it here, Keith? What's the highest storm surge values here? In 14, 15 feet. Well, that's pretty significant. And that's why along the coastline, if you live right along the beach or on the barrier islands, we say, get out. We don't want you there, because as that water comes on shore, it can cause some significant damage. And this is a great example. This is in Texas. And this is near Galveston, the Bolivar Peninsula. Lovely area. You can see all the houses. They're up on stilts. And this is before Hurricane Ike. Hurricane Ike was a Category 2 storm. But because of the way that the ocean is set up here, the Gulf of Mexico is set up here, you can get storm surge values as high as 20 feet in some locations. And the power of water is just incredible, what that wall of water can do and the damage it can produce. So that's before. You can see the arrow there kind of focusing on that one house, and this is after. And you can see the water just wiped things out. It was just incredible what Ike would do. So that's why right along the coast, we say you have to evacuate. Here's another example. A house on the left, another house on the right, and then boom. That's after the storm. That's just an example of what storm surge can do, how powerful a hurricane is, and why it's important to evacuate. Now here's the key, and you can get that information here. If you're going to evacuate, you don't have to go too far. Everyone says, if I'm evacuating, I'm going to Georgia. No, you just have to go to St. Lucie West. That's all you got to do. Just get away from, the water that's right along the coast. Make arrangements with a friend. Go meet someone over there today. Go over to a neighborhood and say, hey, how are you? Can I come here if there's a hurricane coming? I'll bring snacks. That kind of thing. So you don't have to evacuate too far. I know I passed the Holiday Inn as I drove up US 1 here. I know that a lot of people make reservations there ahead of time. You can do that at hotels. If you're going to go to a shelter, be aware that it's not going to be the greatest place in the world, but you'll be safe, and you can't bring a pet to a shelter. So just some things to think about. And while I'm doing that, let me do a little plug here. If you got a smartphone, you can, we have a hurricane tracker app. It's a WPBF Hurricane Tracker, and you can get that on your smartphone. It's for the iPhone, it's for the Android, and what's great is you get all that stuff right in your phone, plus you can set it up to get alerts sent to your phone so you can get updates if a storm forms. If you don't have a smartphone, you can go to our website, WPBF.com, click on the hurricane section. It has all the evacuation zones in there, it has all the shelters in there, has all that important information. All right, I mentioned water is an issue too. Freshwater flooding is a huge concern. And as a storm is making landfall, we're watching very closely how fast that storm is moving. Because the slower the forward speed of that storm, the heavier the rainfall. And even a weak tropical system can dump a tremendous amount of water in a brief period of time. So it's very important that you guys keep aware of the storm's forward speed as well. I mean, this is from Hurricane Floyd. Remember that big storm I showed you earlier? Hurricane Floyd weakened, ended up in North Carolina where it stopped. It just sat right on top of North Carolina. And you can see that stop sign. That's at 7 a.m. That's the same stop sign 8 hours later. Look how much water fell. So the rainfall from a tropical system can be just incredible. There was an example in Texas, tropical depression, not even a storm or a hurricane. And it sat over Alvin, Texas. And I think this audience is old enough to remember that there are two famous things in Alvin, Texas. One is Nolan Ryan. Everyone know who Nolan Ryan is? Baseball pitcher, threw 7 no-hitters. Incredible. Anyway, and in August of 1979, Alvin, Texas had 42 inches of rain in 24 hours. Incredible. 42 inches. That's a year's worth of rain in one day from a tropical depression. So that's what these tropical storms can do. Freshwater flooding, storm surge. It's the water that we're most concerned about from a tropical storm and a hurricane. But winds can be an issue as well. This was the wind damage from Hurricane Andrew. And again, Andrew was pretty much like a 20-mile wide tornado. But if you're staying in your house, and most of you will be, what you need to do is get your house prepared. And the weakest part of your house are your windows. The lady who was up here before me talking about impact windows, that's the greatest thing. Impact windows are great. If you don't have impact windows, put up shutters. If you don't have shutters, put up plywood. Don't put tape up, but put some kind of window protection. Because what happened with Andrew, and we've seen this repeated many times, if you don't have window protection, the wind picks stuff up, it hits your window, it busts the window, you get the wind coming in, all bets are off at that point. You could have all sorts of significant damage. But if you don't live in an evacuation zone, and I don't, my house where I live, we had shutters, now we have impact windows. We have a little hurricane supply in one of our closets. My family knows exactly what to do. They just batten down the hatches, get the stuff up in the yard, in the patio, and you ride out the storm. And like I said before, it's the one storm everyone should survive from. And finally, the other aspect of a hurricane is sometimes we'll get tornadoes, sometimes we'll get some water spouts. They often are on the outer rain bands, and sometimes it's the first thing we deal with as a storm is making landfall. So most of the time, it's like that. It's kind of like that today. Most of the time, this is the greatest place to live. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But every once in a while, maybe once or twice a year, we have to face a challenge. And that challenge is a tropical storm or a hurricane. We know most likely when it's coming. And based on all the information out there, we know what to do. No one should ever panic. No one should ever die. We'll have a mess to clean up, but that's all right. We can do that, and we're going to learn from the next one. So I hope it's a very quiet hurricane season. I hope you see very little of me this year talking about storms, and I thank you very much for your attention today.